She was just a visitor in the hangar until the aircraft malfunctioned and pilots stepped aside. Nobody expected Avery White to save Flight 447 that sunny Tuesday morning at Heathrow's private aviation terminal. She was just a 26-year-old aeronautical engineering graduate from Prague, visiting the hangar as part of a routine supplier inspection. But when the 80 million pounds Gulfstream G650's flight control system catastrophically failed with 12 passengers aboard, and the certified pilots froze in panic, this visitor would make a split-second decision that defied every protocol in aviation history. What happened next would either make her a hero or destroy her career before it even began. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast golden streaks across the pristine floor of Hangar 7 at London Heathrow's exclusive private aviation terminal. The air smelled of jet fuel, polished metal, and the kind of precision that only came with million-pound aircraft maintenance. Every surface gleamed under the industrial lighting, from the spotless concrete floors marked with geometric precision to the towering bay doors that stood open to reveal the bustling tarmac beyond. 3 aircraft dominated the massive space like sleeping giants. A sleek Bombardier Challenger 350 sat in the far corner, its engines cowled and secured for a major overhaul. Nearby, a smaller Citation Mustang waited for its weekly inspection, tools and diagnostic equipment arranged in perfect order around its landing gear. But the centerpiece of the hangar was the magnificent Gulfstream G650, positioned directly under the main work lights, its pearl-white fuselage reflecting the morning sun like polished marble. The G650 represented the pinnacle of private aviation technology, capable of flying 7,000 nautical miles at nearly the speed of sound. Its twin Rolls-Royce BR-725 engines could generate 16,900 pounds of thrust each, propelling passengers from London to Los Angeles in complete luxury. The aircraft's advanced fly-by-wire flight control system made it one of the most sophisticated business jets ever built, with computer systems that could compensate for pilot error and weather conditions in real time. Around the aircraft, a team of certified maintenance technicians moved with practiced efficiency. Each wore the crisp blue uniforms of Meridian Aviation Services, one of Europe's most respected private jet maintenance companies. Their movements were choreographed by years of experience, hands checking connections, eyes scanning diagnostic displays, voices calling out status updates in the clipped, professional language of aviation maintenance. The hangar buzzed with the controlled energy of a major inspection. Pneumatic tools hissed as technicians removed access panels. Computer displays flickered with streams of diagnostic data, the sweet scent of hydraulic fluid mixed with the sharper odors of cleaning solvents and electrical equipment. This was a world where precision mattered more than speed, where a single overlooked detail could mean the difference between a safe flight and catastrophic failure. High above the work floor, the hangar's office complex offered a commanding view of the operations below. Behind floor-to-ceiling windows, executives in expensive suits discussed maintenance schedules and profit margins, their conversations punctuated by the distant sounds of aircraft preparation. The offices were a study in corporate luxury, all polished wood and leather furniture, designed to impress clients who thought nothing of spending £50,000 for a transatlantic flight. The morning shift had started 2 hours earlier, but the hangar never truly emptied. Private aviation operated on schedules that ignored conventional business hours, serving clients whose time was measured in millions per hour. A tech billionaire needed to reach Geneva for an emergency board meeting. A Hollywood producer had to be in Dubai for a film financing deal. A pharmaceutical executive required immediate transport to oversee a clinical trial in Munich. These were the kinds of missions that justified the enormous expense of private jet ownership and the teams of experts required to keep these machines airworthy. The Gulfstream's inspection was routine but comprehensive, the kind of scheduled maintenance that aviation regulations demanded every 600 flight hours. Every system would be tested, every component verified, every connection inspected. The aircraft's sophisticated computer systems would be interrogated for faults that might not become apparent until thousands of feet above the Atlantic Ocean. It was methodical, expensive, and absolutely essential work. But today's inspection would be different. Hidden within the aircraft's complex flight control system, a manufacturing defect that had escaped detection for months was beginning to manifest. A microscopic crack in a fiber optic cable was allowing moisture to infiltrate the signal pathways that connected the flight computers to the control surfaces. The degradation was subtle, intermittent, and completely invisible to standard diagnostic procedures. The morning proceeded according to schedule, with each completed task checked off on comprehensive inspection lists. The Gulfstream's engines had been tested and approved. Its hydraulic systems had passed all pressure tests. The cabin pressurization system had performed flawlessly in ground simulation. But lurking in the aircraft's electronic nervous system, a failure was waiting to reveal itself at the worst possible moment. As the sun climbed higher over Heathrow, casting sharper shadows across the hangar floor, the stage was set for an event that would challenge every assumption about expertise, authority, and the courage required to act when lives hung in the balance. Part 2. Character Introduction. Avery White stepped through the hangar's side entrance at precisely 9:30 a.m., her leather portfolio tucked under one arm and a steaming cup of coffee in her free hand. At 26, she possessed the kind of natural poise that came from growing up in Prague's academic circles, where her father had been a professor of mechanical engineering at Czech Technical University. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothing reflected the careful balance of someone who needed to look professional while being prepared for hands-on technical work. She wore dark jeans, practical flats, and a tailored blazer over a simple white blouse, an outfit that could transition seamlessly from boardroom presentations to crawling around aircraft components. Her portfolio contained meticulously organized documentation about hydraulic component specifications, part of her role as a technical liaison for Eurotech Systems, a Prague-based manufacturer of precision aviation parts. Avery's presence in the hangar was purely professional, the result of a routine supplier audit that brought her to London once every quarter. Eurotech Systems manufactured the hydraulic actuators used in the Gulfstream's landing gear system, and Meridian Aviation was one of their largest European customers. Her job was to ensure that installation procedures were being followed correctly and to gather feedback about component performance in real-world conditions. What made Avery unique wasn't her official role, but her background. She had graduated summa cum laude from Prague's Faculty of Mechanical Engineering with a specialization in aeronautical systems. Her master's thesis had focused on failure analysis in fly-by-wire flight control systems, research that had earned recognition from Boeing's European Engineering Division. She understood aircraft systems not just as individual components, but as integrated networks where the failure of one element could cascade through entire operational chains. During her university years, Avery had spent summers working at Prague's Václav Havel Airport, first as an intern in the maintenance department, then as a junior systems analyst. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated impending system failures, the almost imperceptible vibrations, the microscopic deviations in computer outputs, the patterns of wear that preceded catastrophic breakdowns. Her professors had called her intuitive, but Avery knew it was simply a matter of understanding systems well enough to recognize when they were operating outside normal parameters. Her fluency in English, German, and Czech had made her valuable to Eurotech as they expanded their European operations. She could communicate equally effectively with German precision engineers, British maintenance supervisors, and Czech manufacturing specialists. But more importantly, she could translate technical concepts across cultural and linguistic barriers, ensuring that critical safety information wasn't lost in translation. As she approached the reception desk near the hangar's main entrance, Avery exchanged pleasantries with Margaret Thornton, Meridian's customer relations coordinator. Margaret was a pleasant woman in her 50s who had worked in aviation for over 2 decades and knew every detail of the hangar's operations. "Morning, Avery," Margaret said with a warm smile. "You're here for the quarterly review with our maintenance team." "That's right," Avery replied, setting down her coffee and pulling out her tablet. "I need to inspect the landing gear actuator installations on your Gulfstream fleet and review any maintenance reports related to our components." Margaret nodded and handed her a visitor's badge, along with safety glasses and a high-visibility vest. "Standard procedure, I'm afraid. Health and safety requirements for anyone on the hangar floor." Avery clipped the badge to her blazer and noted the irony of being classified as a visitor despite her extensive knowledge of the very system she was here to inspect. In the hierarchical world of aviation maintenance, credentials mattered more than competence, and her role as a supplier representative placed her outside the official chain of technical authority. The hangar floor was busier than usual, with 3 aircraft undergoing various levels of inspection and maintenance. Avery made her way toward the Gulfstream. noting the organized chaos of a major inspection in progress. Technicians moved purposefully around the aircraft, their actions coordinated by senior mechanics who called out instructions and verified completed tasks. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. She recognized the signs of a well-run operation. Tools returned to designated locations after use, paperwork updated in real time, safety procedures followed without shortcuts. Meridian had built its reputation on this kind of methodical professionalism, and their maintenance records were among the cleanest in the European private aviation industry. But as Avery approached the Gulfstream, she also noted details that others might miss. The slight asymmetry in how the aircraft sat on its landing gear suggested uneven hydraulic pressure in the left main strut. A faint discoloration around one of the engine nacelles indicated a minor oil seepage that might warrant investigation. These weren't immediate safety concerns, but they were the kind of early warning signs that experienced eyes learned to identify. Her role as a supplier representative gave her access to maintenance records and technical discussions, but it also limited her authority to make recommendations about systems outside her specific area of responsibility. She could comment on hydraulic actuator performance, but any observations about flight controls or engine systems would be received as unwelcome input from an outsider. As she prepared to begin her inspection, Avery had no idea that her unique combination of technical knowledge and observational skills would soon be tested in ways that no university course or supplier audit had prepared her for. The morning was about to transform from routine professional duty into a crisis that would demand every ounce of her engineering expertise and personal courage. The maintenance team leader, senior technician Robert Ashford, approached Avery with the practiced courtesy of someone accustomed to managing supplier visits. At 45, he had spent over 2 decades in aviation maintenance, progressing from apprentice to team leader through a combination of technical skill and unwavering adherence to established procedures. His graying hair and weathered hands spoke to years of working around aircraft, but his sharp eyes missed nothing that happened on his hangar floor. "Ms. White, welcome back to Meridian," he said, extending a hand that bore the permanent stains of hydraulic fluid and engine oil. "I trust your flight from Prague was comfortable." "Very smooth, thank you," Avery replied, noting the subtle emphasis he placed on her surname rather than her professional credentials. In the informal hierarchy of the hangar, she was a supplier representative first, an engineer second, and a woman third, a combination that automatically placed her outside the inner circle of technical decision-making. Ashford gestured toward the Gulfstream, where several technicians were conducting various inspection procedures. "We're conducting the 600-hour inspection on this aircraft. Your hydraulic actuators have performed flawlessly, I'm pleased to report. No unusual wear patterns, no pressure anomalies, excellent reliability ratings across the board." As they walked around the aircraft, Avery observed the team dynamics that governed the hangar's operations. The senior technicians moved with quiet authority, their decades of experience evident in every gesture. Junior mechanics deferred to their judgment without question, understanding that aviation maintenance allowed no room for egos or experimental approaches. Certification levels determined who could sign off on critical systems, and those signatures carried both legal authority and personal liability. James Morrison, the lead avionics technician, was deep in conversation with his team about the aircraft's sophisticated flight control systems. At 38, he represented the new generation of aviation professionals who understood both traditional mechanical systems and the complex software that increasingly governed modern aircraft behavior. His conversation was punctuated by references to system diagnostics, fault codes, and computer-generated status reports. "The flight management system is showing all green," Morrison reported to Ashford. "Navigation computers are calibrated and responding normally. Flight control surfaces are tracking command inputs within acceptable parameters. The fly-by-wire system passed all ground tests with flying colors." Avery listened to the technical discussion while ostensibly focusing on her hydraulic system documentation. The language was familiar. She had studied these exact systems during her graduate research. But her role as an outside observer meant she could listen without being expected to contribute. This invisible status often provided insights that more prominent participants missed. Near the aircraft's nose, Captain David Henley and First Officer Sarah Chen were reviewing the flight plan for the afternoon's departure. Both pilots carried themselves with the confident bearing of professionals who had accumulated thousands of flight hours in high-performance aircraft. Captain Henley, a former RAF pilot with silver hair and precise movements, commanded immediate respect from everyone in the hangar. His reputation for safety and professionalism had made him one of the most requested pilots in European private aviation. First Officer Chin, younger but equally accomplished, had transitioned to civilian aviation after flying commercial airliners for Lufthansa. Her technical knowledge of modern aircraft systems was encyclopedic, and her attention to detail had prevented several potential incidents during her brief tenure with Meridian. "Weather looks perfect for the Geneva run," Captain Henley observed, studying meteorological reports on his tablet. "Light winds, clear skies, no significant turbulence predicted along the route. Should be a textbook flight." The passenger list for the afternoon's flight read like a directory of European business elite. The primary passengers were executives from Steinberg Industries, a German pharmaceutical company, traveling to Geneva for crucial meetings with Swiss regulatory authorities. The outcome of those meetings could determine whether their new diabetes medication would receive European Union approval, affecting millions of patients and billions in potential revenue. Dr. Klaus Steinberg himself would be aboard, along with his chief scientific officer, regulatory affairs director, and key members of their legal team. Also joining them were two independent medical consultants whose expertise would be crucial during the regulatory presentations. The flight represented months of preparation and coordination, with Meridian Aviation selected specifically for their reputation for reliability and discretion. What none of the passengers knew was that their flight would depend not just on the skill of the certified pilots and the expertise of the licensed maintenance team, but on the observations of a young Czech engineer whose official role gave her no authority to influence their safety. As Avery continued her inspection, she noted the subtle social currents that flowed through the hangar. The maintenance technicians respected the pilots but maintained professional distance. The pilots trusted the maintenance team but rarely engaged in detailed technical discussions about systems they didn't directly control. Management personnel focused on schedules and customer satisfaction, leaving technical decisions to certified professionals. Everyone operated within clearly defined roles, following procedures that had been refined over decades of aviation experience. The system worked because everyone understood their place within it and respected the boundaries that separated different areas of responsibility. But those same boundaries that provided order and safety could also create blind spots where critical information might be overlooked or dismissed. Avery's position as a supplier representative placed her in an interesting liminal space. She possessed technical knowledge that exceeded many of the maintenance staff, but lacked the institutional authority to act on that knowledge. She could observe and document, but any recommendations had to be filtered through official channels and validated by certified personnel. This dynamic would soon be tested in ways that no one in the hangar could anticipate, when technical knowledge and institutional authority would come into direct conflict, and the life or death decisions would fall to someone whose role had never prepared her for such responsibility. Avery's inspection of the hydraulic actuator systems began with the methodical precision that had earned her recognition throughout her academic career. She connected her diagnostic tablet to the aircraft's maintenance interface, downloading the complete operational history of every Eurotech component installed on the Gulfstream. The data streams revealed patterns that told the story of how the aircraft had been used over the past 6 months: flight hours, landing cycles, pressure variations, and temperature fluctuations. "Interesting," she murmured, studying a series of pressure readings from the left main landing gear actuator. The variations were within acceptable parameters, but they showed a subtle pattern that suggested a minor seal degradation. Not dangerous, but worth monitoring over the next inspection cycle. Robert Ashford approached as she completed her initial data review. "Finding anything we should be concerned about?" Avery pulled up a comparative analysis on her tablet screen. "Your maintenance records show excellent component reliability, but I'm seeing some minor variations in the left main gear actuator that suggest the primary seal might be experiencing early wear. The pressures are still well within operational limits, but the trend suggests you might want to schedule a replacement during the next major overhaul." Ashford examined the data with professional interest. He had worked with enough supplier representatives to recognize when someone truly understood the systems they were discussing versus those who simply repeated information from technical manuals. Avery's analysis demonstrated the kind of deep system knowledge that came from years of academic study combined with practical experience. "How did you identify that pattern?" he asked, genuinely curious about her methodology. Seal degradation typically manifests as gradual pressure variations during temperature cycling, Avery explained, highlighting specific data points on her display. "The changes are subtle, maybe 2 or 3 psi variations that most people would dismiss as normal operational fluctuations. But when you analyze them across multiple flight cycles and correlate them with ambient temperature data, you can see the beginning of a failure progression." She pulled up a predictive analysis chart that projected the seal's remaining operational life based on current degradation rates. "Based on these trends, you probably have another 200 flight hours before replacement becomes necessary. But monitoring the progression will let you schedule the maintenance at your convenience rather than waiting for an unexpected failure." James Morrison, who had been listening to the conversation while completing his avionics checks, walked over to examine Avery's analysis. As the lead avionics technician, he was responsible for the aircraft's electronic systems, but he appreciated the interconnected nature of modern aircraft, where hydraulic, electrical, and computer systems work together in complex relationships. "That's impressive diagnostic work," he said, studying her predictive maintenance calculations. "Most supplier reps just check that their parts are installed correctly and move on. You're actually analyzing operational performance data." Avery smiled, pleased that her expertise was being recognized. "My graduate research focused on predictive failure analysis in integrated aircraft systems. I developed algorithms that could identify failure patterns weeks or months before traditional diagnostic methods detected problems." Morrison's interest was clearly piqued. "What kind of systems did you study?" "Primarily fly-by-wire flight control systems," Avery replied. "My thesis examined how minor degradations in sensor networks could cascade into major control authority losses. I spent 2 years analyzing accident data from various aircraft types, looking for patterns that preceded control system failures." The conversation had attracted the attention of several other technicians, who gathered around to listen as Avery described her research methodology. In the collaborative environment of the hangar, technical expertise was respected regardless of its source, and her academic credentials carried weight among professionals who understood the complexity of modern aircraft systems. "The challenge with fly-by-wire systems," she continued, "is that they're designed to compensate for minor failures automatically. The computers can mask degrading performance until multiple redundant systems fail simultaneously. By then, pilots may have very little warning before experiencing complete control authority loss." Captain Henley, who had been reviewing weather reports nearby, overheard the technical discussion and approached the group. His experience as a former military pilot had taught him the value of understanding the systems he depended on for safe flight operations. "Ms. White, your research sounds fascinating," he said. "Have you encountered any specific failure modes that pilots should be particularly aware of?" Avery considered the question carefully, aware that she was now discussing safety issues with the pilot who would be responsible for the afternoon's flight. The most dangerous scenarios involve intermittent failures that don't trigger immediate warning systems. A sensor might provide incorrect data for brief periods, then return to normal operation. The flight computers interpret these glitches as temporary anomalies and don't alert the crew. She pulled up a case study on her tablet showing a business jet accident that had occurred 2 years earlier in Germany. This aircraft experienced intermittent flight control sensor failures for several weeks before the accident. The problems were so brief and irregular that ground diagnostics never detected them. During the accident flight, multiple sensors failed simultaneously during a critical phase of landing approach. Captain Henley studied the accident analysis with professional interest. "What would you recommend for detecting these kinds of intermittent failures?" "Continuous data logging with pattern analysis," Avery replied immediately. "Instead of just checking systems during ground tests, airlines should monitor sensor outputs throughout entire flights, looking for brief anomalies that might indicate developing problems. Most aircraft generate terabytes of operational data that never gets analyzed for predictive maintenance purposes." The technical discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with Avery demonstrating her expertise across multiple aircraft systems. Her knowledge extended far beyond hydraulic components to encompass the integrated networks that governed modern aviation safety. She could discuss engine performance algorithms, navigation system redundancies, and emergency procedure protocols with the fluency of someone who had studied these systems at the deepest level. By the time she completed her official inspection duties, Avery had earned a level of respect from the maintenance team that few supplier representatives achieved. Her technical competence was obvious, her analytical methodology was sound, and her communication skills allowed her to explain complex concepts in accessible terms. But this respect came with an important limitation. Despite her expertise, she remained an outside observer with no official authority over aircraft operations or safety decisions. She could offer insights and recommendations, but the final responsibility for all technical decisions rested with Meridian-certified personnel. This distinction between knowledge and authority would soon become critically important. As the afternoon's flight preparations began, and a hidden system failure started to manifest in ways that standard diagnostic procedures were not designed to detect. As the morning progressed, Avery found herself in the peculiar position of possessing extensive knowledge about aircraft systems, while lacking any official authority to act on that knowledge. Her role as a supplier representative confined her to a narrow scope of responsibility: hydraulic actuator performance, despite her broader expertise in aeronautical engineering and flight control systems. The limitations of her position became apparent during a discussion about the Gulfstream's flight control calibration procedures. James Morrison was explaining to a junior technician how the aircraft's fly-by-wire system conducted automatic self-tests during power-up sequences, checking sensor alignment and control surface responses before each flight. The system runs through about 200 individual test protocols, Morrison explained, reading from a technical manual. If any component fails to respond within acceptable parameters, the system flags it for maintenance attention. Avery listened to the explanation while completing her hydraulic system documentation, recognizing several critical gaps in the testing methodology Morrison described. Her graduate research had identified specific failure modes that could escape detection by standard self-test protocols, particularly intermittent sensor malfunctions that occurred only under specific temperature or vibration conditions. She wanted to mention these concerns, but protocol dictated that supplier representatives should focus solely on their designated components unless specifically asked for broader input. Any unsolicited technical advice could be perceived as overstepping professional boundaries or questioning the competence of certified maintenance personnel. The Hangar's organizational structure reinforced these limitations through clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Senior Technician Ashford held final authority over all maintenance decisions, supported by specialists like Morrison who managed specific systems. Their certifications carried legal weight, and their signatures on maintenance documents represented personal liability for aircraft safety. Captain Henley and First Officer Chen occupied a separate sphere of authority focused on flight operations rather than maintenance. They trusted the ground crew to deliver an airworthy aircraft and rarely questioned technical decisions made by certified maintenance personnel. This division of responsibility had evolved over decades to ensure clear accountability and prevent overlapping authorities that might create confusion during critical situations. Avery's credentials, impressive as they were, didn't fit neatly into this established hierarchy. Her aeronautical engineering degree qualified her to understand complex aircraft systems, but her employment as a supplier representative placed her outside the formal certification structure that governed aviation maintenance. She could observe, analyze, and document, but any recommendations had to be filtered through official channels. This systemic constraint became more frustrating as she observed the preparation procedures for the afternoon's flight. The maintenance team was conducting their inspections with admirable thoroughness, following established checklists and verification protocols. But their approach was necessarily conservative, focused on identifying obvious problems rather than analyzing subtle patterns that might indicate developing issues. Margaret Thornton, the customer relations coordinator, reinforced these limitations during a conversation about inspection protocols. "We appreciate your technical expertise," she told Avery, "but our insurance requirements mandate that all safety-related decisions be made by personnel holding appropriate aviation maintenance certifications. We can't act on recommendations from supplier representatives, regardless of their qualifications." The insurance angle added another layer of systemic constraint. Meridian's coverage was structured around traditional certification hierarchies, with specific requirements about who could authorize various maintenance and operational decisions. Deviating from these protocols, even to incorporate valuable technical insights, could void coverage and expose the company to enormous liability. Dr. Klaus Steinberg and his team arrived at the hangar just before noon, adding another dimension to the systemic pressures governing the flight preparation. As paying customers whose business was worth millions to Meridian, they expected their aircraft to be ready for departure without delays or complications. Their pharmaceutical company's regulatory timeline didn't accommodate maintenance discoveries or extended troubleshooting procedures. The presence of high-profile passengers intensified the pressure to maintain schedules and avoid raising unnecessary concerns. Captain Henley briefed the passengers on the flight plan and weather conditions, projecting the confidence and professionalism that justified Meridian's premium pricing. Any suggestion of technical issues or safety concerns would require compelling evidence and clear authority to investigate. Avery watched these dynamics unfold while completing her final hydraulic system checks. She understood that the aviation industry's emphasis on certification and established procedures had evolved from decades of accidents and near misses. The rigid hierarchy served important safety functions by ensuring that critical decisions were made by qualified personnel following proven protocols. But she also recognized that this same system could create blind spots where valuable information might be overlooked or dismissed. Her academic research had documented several accidents where outside expertise had identified problems that certified personnel missed, but where institutional barriers prevented effective communication of critical safety information. The afternoon departure was scheduled for 2 p.m., giving the maintenance team another 2 hours to complete their inspections and prepare the aircraft for flight. Everything was proceeding according to established timelines, with each task checked off methodically as teams worked through comprehensive preparation checklists. Yet Avery couldn't shake a growing sense of unease about something she couldn't quite identify. Her experience with predictive failure analysis had taught her to trust subtle instincts about system behavior, even when diagnostic equipment showed normal readings. There was something about the Gulfstream's preparation that felt slightly off, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what was triggering her concern. The challenge was that her institutional role provided no mechanism for investigating these instincts or raising concerns about systems outside her designated area of responsibility. She was trapped between her technical knowledge and the systemic limitations that defined her authority, watching as the aircraft moved closer to departure while unable to act on the growing certainty that something was wrong. The passenger briefing for Flight 447 began promptly at 1:15 p.m. in Meridian's Executive Lounge, a luxuriously appointed space designed to reinforce the premium experience that justified the extraordinary cost of private aviation. Captain Henley stood before the assembled group with the practiced confidence of someone who had conducted thousands of similar briefings throughout his career. Dr. Klaus Steinberg commanded immediate attention despite his unassuming appearance. At 62, the pharmaceutical executive possessed the quiet intensity of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of lives. His graying beard and wire-rimmed glasses gave him a professorial appearance that belied his reputation as one of Europe's most successful biotech entrepreneurs. The medication his company was seeking EU approval for represented 8 years of research and development, with the potential to revolutionize diabetes treatment worldwide. Accompanying Dr. Steinberg were 5 other passengers, each critical to the Geneva presentation. Dr. Helena Richter, the company's chief scientific officer, carried herself with the precision of someone who had spent decades designing clinical trials and analyzing safety data. Her presentation materials included 3 years of patient outcome data that would form the foundation of their regulatory submission. Marcus Weber, the regulatory affairs director, had coordinated with Swiss and EU authorities for months to arrange the Geneva meetings. His briefcase contained thousands of pages of documentation, each detail crucial to demonstrating their medication's safety and efficacy. A single misplaced study or incorrect data point could delay approval by months and cost the company hundreds of millions in lost revenue. The 2 independent medical consultants, Dr. Sarah Brighton from Oxford and Dr. Alessandro Rossi from Milan, would provide third-party validation of the clinical trial results. Their reputations for objectivity and scientific rigor were essential for convincing skeptical regulators that the medication deserved accelerated approval status. Finally, Jennifer Walsh, the company's senior legal counsel, would address any regulatory questions about patent protection and manufacturing compliance. Her expertise in international pharmaceutical law had guided the company through similar approval processes in other markets. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Henley began, "welcome aboard Flight 447 to Geneva. Our flight time this afternoon will be approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes, with arrival scheduled for 4:45 p.m. local time. Weather conditions are excellent along our entire route, with clear skies and light winds. We'll be cruising at 45,000 feet for optimal efficiency and passenger comfort. First Officer Chen added technical details about the aircraft's capabilities and safety features. The Gulfstream G650 represents the finest in business aviation technology. Our twin Rolls-Royce engines provide exceptional reliability and performance, while the aircraft's advanced flight management system ensures the smoothest possible journey to your destination. The flight plan called for a northeasterly departure from Heathrow, climbing rapidly to cruise altitude while following established airways across France and into Swiss airspace. The route had been carefully chosen to avoid areas of predicted turbulence and minimize exposure to adverse weather conditions. Air traffic control had already approved their preferred altitude and routing, ensuring minimal delays during the critical business travel timeframe. Dr. Steinberg asked about communication capabilities during the flight, explaining that his team might need to coordinate with colleagues in Geneva as they approached the meeting. Captain Henley assured him that the aircraft's satellite communication system would provide reliable connectivity throughout the journey, allowing them to finalize presentation details and respond to any last-minute regulatory questions. The briefing covered standard safety procedures, emergency equipment locations, and the aircraft's operational capabilities. Captain Henley's presentation was designed to inspire confidence while educating passengers about the sophisticated technology that would ensure their safe arrival in Geneva. His tone conveyed the professional competence that had made him one of Europe's most requested pilots for high-stakes business flights. What Captain Henley didn't mention, because he had no way of knowing, was that the aircraft's sophisticated flight control system was experiencing intermittent sensor anomalies that hadn't yet triggered any warning systems. The problems were so brief and irregular that the aircraft's diagnostic computers dismissed them as temporary glitches rather than indications of developing system failures. Avery watched the passenger briefing from the hangar floor, where she was completing her final inspection documentation. Through the lounge's floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the animated discussion among Dr. Steinberg's team as they reviewed their presentation materials one last time. The importance of their mission was evident in every gesture and expression. The maintenance team had completed their final preparations, with Senior Technician Ashford signing off on the comprehensive inspection checklist. Every system had been tested and verified according to established protocols. The aircraft's sophisticated diagnostic computers reported normal operation across all flight-critical components. James Morrison had completed his avionics checks, confirming that the flight management system, navigation computers, and communication equipment were functioning within acceptable parameters. The fly-by-wire flight control system had passed all ground tests, with control surfaces responding normally to pilot inputs and computer commands. The fuel load had been calculated precisely for the Geneva flight, with additional reserves for weather contingencies and potential routing changes. Ground crews had completed their exterior inspection, checking for any signs of damage or wear that might affect flight safety. The aircraft's maintenance logbook contained no outstanding discrepancies or deferred maintenance items. By every measurable standard, the Gulfstream G650 was ready for safe departure. The passengers were experienced business travelers who understood the importance of maintaining schedules. The pilots were highly qualified professionals with extensive experience in high-performance aircraft. The maintenance team had followed every established procedure for ensuring airworthiness. Yet Avery's growing sense of unease continued to intensify as she watched the final preparations. Her training in predictive failure analysis had taught her to recognize subtle patterns that might indicate developing problems, even when all standard indicators showed normal operation. Something about the afternoon's activities felt slightly wrong, though she couldn't identify the specific source of her concern. The passengers boarded at 1:45 p.m., settling into the aircraft's luxurious cabin while reviewing their presentation materials. Dr. Steinberg's team radiated the focused energy of people preparing for a meeting that could determine the fate of their life's work. Their success in Geneva would affect not just their company's financial future, but the health outcomes of millions of diabetes patients worldwide. As the Gulfstream's engines began their startup sequence, Avery found herself in an impossible position, increasingly certain that something was wrong, but lacking any specific evidence or institutional authority to delay the flight. The aircraft was about to depart with 12 people aboard, carrying them toward a hidden danger that standard procedures had failed to detect. The first anomaly appeared on Avery's diagnostic tablet at 1:52 p.m., 8 minutes before the scheduled departure time. She was completing her final documentation when an unusual data pattern caught her attention. A brief spike in hydraulic pressure that lasted only 0.3 seconds before returning to normal parameters. The variation was so small that the aircraft's own diagnostic systems had dismissed it as electronic noise. But Avery's experience with predictive failure analysis had taught her to pay attention to anomalies that others might overlook. She pulled up the complete hydraulic system log, scanning backwards through the afternoon's data to see if similar spikes had occurred earlier. What she found made her pause. 7 identical pressure variations had occurred over the past 3 hours, each lasting less than half a second, each dismissed by the aircraft's computers as insignificant. But the timing pattern was what concerned her most. The intervals between spikes were decreasing steadily, suggesting an accelerating failure mode. "That's odd," she murmured, cross-referencing the pressure spikes with other system data. The anomalies coincided with brief electrical fluctuations in the aircraft's primary flight control circuits, variations so small they fell within normal operational tolerances, but suspicious when correlated with the hydraulic irregularities. Avery had encountered similar patterns during her graduate research, studying an accident involving a corporate jet that had experienced catastrophic flight control failure during approach. The investigation had revealed that intermittent electrical anomalies had been occurring for weeks before the accident, but they were so brief and irregular that ground diagnostics never detected them. She walked quickly toward the aircraft, where James Morrison was conducting his final avionics checks. The Gulfstream's engines were spinning up to idle power, and Captain Henley was working through his pre-flight checklist in the cockpit. The passengers had settled into their seats, reviewing presentation materials and checking their mobile devices one last time. "James," Avery called, trying to keep her voice level despite growing urgency, "I'm seeing some unusual data patterns in the hydraulic system logs. Could you take a look at this?" Morrison glanced up from his diagnostic equipment, noting the concern in her expression. "What kind of patterns?" Avery showed him the pressure spike data on her tablet, highlighting the correlation with electrical fluctuations. "These anomalies are occurring at decreasing intervals. In my research, I've seen similar patterns precede major system failures." Morrison studied the data carefully, his experience with avionics systems helping him understand the implications of what Avery was showing him. "The individual spikes are within normal parameters," he said slowly, "but the pattern is definitely unusual. Have you seen this kind of thing before?" "Yes, in accident investigation data," Avery replied. "A business jet in Germany experienced similar intermittent anomalies for several weeks before losing primary flight control authority during landing approach. The investigation found that moisture infiltration in fiber optic cables was causing brief signal interruptions." Morrison's expression grew more serious as he absorbed this information. "You think we might have a similar problem?" "I think we need to investigate further before this aircraft departs," Avery said firmly. "The pattern suggests an accelerating failure mode that could manifest during flight." From the cockpit, Captain Henley's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ground crew, we're ready for pushback. Request clearance to taxi." Morrison looked between Avery's data and the aircraft's official diagnostic displays, which showed all systems operating normally. As the lead avionics technician, he had the authority to delay departure if he identified safety concerns, but he also understood the enormous pressure to maintain schedules with high-profile passengers aboard. "The aircraft's own diagnostics aren't flagging any problems," he said, uncertainty evident in his voice. "These pressure spikes could be normal system behavior that we just haven't noticed before." Quote. Avery pulled up additional data from her tablet, showing similar aircraft that had experienced comparable anomalies. "James, look at this trend analysis. When these patterns appear in fly-by-wire systems, they typically indicate degrading sensor networks or control signal integrity. The aircraft's computers are designed to compensate for minor anomalies, but they can't predict when multiple failures might occur simultaneously." Near the aircraft's boarding stairs, Senior Technician Ashford was conducting his final exterior inspection, checking that all access panels were secured and that no tools or equipment had been left around the aircraft. The ground crew was positioning the pushback tractor, preparing to move the Gulfstream away from the hangar and toward the departure taxiway. Dr. Steinberg appeared in the cabin doorway, checking his watch and clearly eager to depart on schedule. The pharmaceutical executive's presentation was scheduled for 6 p.m. Geneva time, and any delays could jeopardize months of coordination with Swiss regulatory authorities. His team's work represented not just their company's future, but potential breakthrough treatments for millions of diabetes patients worldwide. Morrison made a decision that reflected both his technical expertise and his understanding of institutional pressures. "I'll run one more diagnostic check on the flight control systems," he told Avery. "But unless we find something definitive, we can't delay departure based on data patterns that might be normal system behavior." He connected his diagnostic equipment to the aircraft's avionics bay, initiating a comprehensive test of the flight control sensors and signal processing systems. The test would take approximately 10 minutes, time they didn't really have if the flight was to maintain its scheduled departure slot. Avery watched the diagnostic procedures with growing frustration, knowing that standard tests were designed to identify obvious failures, rather than subtle degradations that might only manifest under specific operational conditions. Her research had shown that the most dangerous flight control failures often escaped detection until pilots were already dealing with emergency situations. The aircraft's sophisticated computers were programmed to compensate for minor sensor anomalies, making it nearly impossible to detect developing problems during ground testing. The intermittent nature of the electrical fluctuations she had identified meant that they might not occur during the limited duration of Morrison's diagnostic check. Captain Henley's voice came over the intercom again. "Ground crew, we're showing a slight delay in our departure clearance. What's the status on final preparations?" Ashford responded immediately. "All ground checks complete, Captain. Ready for pushback on your command." Morrison's diagnostic test was showing normal results across all flight control systems, exactly as Avery had predicted. The intermittent anomalies she had identified weren't occurring during the controlled test environment, and the aircraft's computers reported full functionality in all primary and backup systems. "Everything's checking out normal," Morrison reported, disconnecting his equipment. "The pressure spikes you identified could be normal hydraulic system behavior during temperature stabilization." Avery stared at the aircraft, knowing with growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong despite the absence of definitive evidence. Her training in predictive failure analysis was screaming warnings that she couldn't prove with standard diagnostic procedures. The pattern recognition skills that had earned her academic recognition were detecting a problem that existing systems couldn't identify. But her role as a supplier representative provided no mechanism for delaying departure based on intuitive concerns that couldn't be verified through established testing protocols. She was about to watch 12 people board an aircraft that she believed was carrying a hidden danger, unable to do anything more than document her concerns in reports that no one would read until after something went wrong. The Gulfstream's engines continued their warm-up cycle, and the passengers settled into their seats for what they expected would be a routine flight to Geneva. The stage was set for a confrontation between institutional authority and individual expertise, with lives hanging in the balance. Senior technician Robert Ashford approached Morrison's diagnostic station just as the avionics check was completing, his expression reflecting the controlled urgency of someone managing a high-profile departure with paying customers aboard. At 1:58 p.m., they were already 2 minutes behind their scheduled pushback time, and any further delays would affect their departure slot and potentially cascade into broader scheduling disruptions. "James, what's the status?" Ashford asked, noting Avery's presence near the diagnostic equipment. "Captain Henley is requesting immediate clearance for taxi." Morrison glanced at Avery before responding, clearly torn between the normal test results and her concerning data analysis. "Ms. White has identified some unusual patterns in the hydraulic and electrical systems, brief anomalies that might indicate developing problems." Ashford's expression hardened as he absorbed this information. With over 2 decades of aviation maintenance experience, he had learned to distinguish between legitimate safety concerns and the kind of theoretical problems that could delay flights indefinitely without providing meaningful safety benefits. His responsibility extended beyond technical perfection to include operational efficiency and customer satisfaction. "What kind of anomalies?" he asked, his tone already suggesting skepticism about concerns raised by a supplier representative rather than certified maintenance personnel. Avery stepped forward, pulling up her data analysis on the tablet screen. "I've identified 7 pressure spikes in the hydraulic system over the past 3 hours, each correlated with brief electrical fluctuations in the flight control circuits. The intervals between anomalies are decreasing steadily, suggesting an accelerating failure mode." Ashford studied the data briefly, his trained eye focusing on the actual magnitude of the variations rather than the pattern Avery was highlighting. "These pressure spikes are well within normal operational parameters," he said dismissively. Every hydraulic system experiences minor fluctuations during temperature stabilization and pressure cycling. But the pattern suggests, Avery began, only to be interrupted by Ashford's firm response. Ms. White, I appreciate your concern, but pattern analysis isn't part of our standard maintenance protocols. We follow established procedures that have proven reliable over decades of aviation operations. Unless our certified diagnostic equipment identifies a specific problem, we can't delay departures based on theoretical concerns. The institutional weight behind Ashford's response was unmistakable. As a senior technician with legal authority over aircraft maintenance decisions, his judgment carried both professional credibility and personal liability. Aviation regulations were structured around certification hierarchies specifically to prevent unauthorized personnel from making safety-related decisions that could affect flight operations. Morrison found himself caught between his respect for Avery's technical expertise and his obligation to follow established maintenance protocols. The diagnostic tests show all systems operating normally, he said reluctantly. I can't find any evidence of the problems Ms. White is concerned about. From the aircraft's cabin, Dr. Steinberg appeared again in the doorway, his impatience becoming more obvious as the departure delay extended. The pharmaceutical executive schedule was built around precise timing that had taken months to coordinate with Swiss regulatory authorities. Each minute of delay increased the risk that their critical presentation might be postponed or canceled entirely. Gentlemen, we have a very tight schedule in Geneva, Dr. Steinberg called down to the ground crew. Is there a technical problem we should be concerned about? Captain Henley's voice joined the conversation over the aircraft's intercom system. Ground control, we need immediate pushback clearance or we'll lose our departure slot. What's causing the delay? The convergence of customer pressure, scheduling demands, and institutional protocols created an environment where Avery's concerns were increasingly marginalized, despite their potential validity. Ashford was responsible for balancing safety considerations against operational requirements, and her analysis didn't provide the kind of definitive evidence that justified disrupting a high-profile flight. Ms. White, Ashford said with forced patience, your role here is to inspect hydraulic actuator components, not to evaluate overall aircraft systems. The flight control diagnostics are outside your area of responsibility, and our certified avionics technician has confirmed normal operation across all relevant systems. The dismissal carried multiple layers of institutional authority: professional certification, legal liability, and operational responsibility. Ashford's decision was supported by established procedures that had evolved over decades to ensure clear accountability and prevent unauthorized interference with flight operations. Margaret Thornton, the customer relations coordinator, approached the group with obvious concern about the growing departure delay. Her responsibility focused on maintaining client satisfaction and protecting Meridian's reputation for reliable service among high-value customers who had multiple options for private aviation services. Robert, Dr. Steinberg's team is asking about the delay, she said quietly. They have critical meetings that can't be rescheduled. If there's a legitimate safety concern, we need to address it immediately. If not, we need to get this aircraft moving. Avery made one final attempt to communicate the urgency of her concerns. The pattern I've identified is identical to precursor data from a fatal accident involving similar aircraft systems. The intermittent nature of these anomalies means they won't appear during standard ground testing, but they could manifest catastrophically during flight operations. Her reference to accident data carried professional weight, but it also highlighted the theoretical nature of her concerns. Aviation maintenance decisions required concrete evidence of specific problems, rather than pattern-based predictions about potential failures that might or might not occur. Ashford's response reflected the institutional constraints that governed his decision-making authority. Ms. White, if you believe this aircraft has safety problems, you're welcome to file a formal report with the aviation authorities. But I can't ground an aircraft based on data interpretations that our own diagnostic systems don't support. The offer to file a formal report was both procedurally correct and practically meaningless. Such reports typically took weeks or months to investigate, and they required evidence that met strict regulatory standards for challenging maintenance decisions made by certified professionals. Morrison completed his final systems check, confirming once again that all aircraft diagnostics showed normal operation. All avionics systems are green, he reported to Ashford. Flight controls, navigation, communication, everything is within acceptable parameters. Captain Henley's voice crackled over the intercom with increasing urgency. Ground crew, we've lost our original departure slot. Air traffic control is offering us a new window in 15 minutes, but we need to begin taxi immediately. The operational pressure had reached a critical point where further delays would cascade into significant scheduling disruptions affecting not just Steinberg's mission, but potentially other flights and passengers throughout Meridian's afternoon operations. Ashford made his final decision with the authority of someone whose certification and experience qualified him to balance safety considerations against operational realities. All systems check normal. Aircraft is cleared for departure. As the ground crew began positioning equipment for pushback, Avery stood watching helplessly, while an aircraft she believed was carrying hidden dangers prepared to depart with 12 people aboard. Her expertise had been acknowledged but ultimately dismissed, her concerns marginalized by institutional structures that prioritized procedural compliance over individual analysis. The Gulfstream's engines increased to taxi power as Captain Henley began the process of moving away from the hangar toward the departure runway. Dr. Steinberg and his team settled back into their seats, trusting that the aviation professionals responsible for their safety had made appropriate decisions based on established expertise and proven procedures. But Avery's growing certainty about the aircraft's hidden problems meant that she was about to witness either the vindication of institutional authority or a catastrophic demonstration of why individual expertise sometimes mattered more than procedural compliance. At 2:03 p.m., as the Gulfstream began its taxi toward runway 27L, Avery's diagnostic tablet registered another pressure anomaly, this time significantly larger than the previous spikes and lasting nearly 2 full seconds. The hydraulic fluctuation was accompanied by a corresponding electrical surge that briefly affected multiple flight control circuits simultaneously. What made this occurrence particularly alarming was its timing. The anomaly had appeared during the aircraft's transition from ground power to internal systems, exactly when the flight control computers were calibrating themselves for takeoff. "James!" Avery called urgently, running toward Morrison, who was securing his diagnostic equipment. "Look at this," the anomaly just repeated, "but it's much larger this time." Morrison stopped his equipment packing and examined Avery's tablet display. The new data showed pressure variations that were approaching the upper limits of acceptable parameters, while the electrical fluctuations had affected systems across multiple aircraft networks. Most concerning was the timing correlation. The anomaly had occurred precisely when the flight control system was conducting its pre-flight calibration sequence. "This is definitely outside normal parameters," Morrison said, his voice carrying new urgency. The electrical surge affected primary flight control channels, backup systems, and navigation computers simultaneously. From the taxiway, Captain Henley's voice came over the radio with routine taxi communications. "Heathrow ground, Meridian 447 requesting taxi to runway 27L for departure." The aircraft was moving steadily away from the hangar, following the yellow centerline markings toward the departure area. Avery pulled up her predictive analysis algorithms, running the new data point through failure progression models she had developed during her graduate research. The results were alarming. The accelerating pattern of anomalies suggested a cascading failure that could manifest within the next 30 to 45 minutes of operation, well within the flight time to Geneva. "James, we need to contact the aircraft immediately," she said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "This pattern indicates imminent system failure during flight operations." Morrison was already reaching for his radio when Senior Technician Ashford approached, having noticed the unusual activity around the diagnostic equipment after the aircraft's departure. His expression reflected frustration at the continued disruption to what should have been a routine departure process. "What's the problem now?" Ashford asked, his tone suggesting limited patience for additional concerns from the supplier representative who had already delayed their departure. Morrison showed him the latest data on Avery's tablet. "We've got a significant anomaly that occurred during the flight control calibration sequence. Multiple systems were affected simultaneously." Ashford studied the new information, recognizing that the magnitude and scope of this anomaly was qualitatively different from the earlier pressure spikes Avery had identified. The electrical surge had affected primary and backup systems across multiple aircraft networks, a pattern that suggested systemic problems rather than isolated component variations. "When did this occur?" he asked, checking his watch against the aircraft's taxi timeline. "Exactly when they switched from ground power to internal systems," Avery replied. "The flight control computers were calibrating themselves for takeoff, and the anomaly disrupted that process across multiple redundant channels. From the taxiway, they could see the Gulfstream approaching the runway holding area, where Captain Henley would conduct his final pre-flight checks before receiving takeoff clearance. The aircraft's external lights were cycling through their normal pre-departure sequence, and the passengers remained unaware of any potential problems with their flight. Morrison made the critical decision to contact the aircraft directly. Meridian 447, this is ground maintenance. We're seeing some unusual system readings that occurred during your taxi. Request you hold position for additional diagnostics. Captain Henley's response reflected both professionalism and concern about the timing of this request. Ground maintenance. We're currently number 2 for departure. What kind of system readings are you referring to? Sir, we're showing electrical anomalies that affected multiple flight control circuits during your power transfer sequence. Recommend returning to the hangar for further investigation. The radio transmission created an immediate decision point for Captain Henley, who was responsible for evaluating whether maintenance concerns justified aborting a departure with high-profile passengers aboard. His experience as a former military pilot had taught him to take maintenance warnings seriously, but he also understood the operational pressures surrounding Dr. Steinberg's critical mission. Ground maintenance. Our cockpit displays are showing all systems normal. Flight controls are responding appropriately to inputs. What specific concerns are you identifying? Avery grabbed Morrison's radio microphone, knowing that her technical expertise might be crucial for communicating the severity of the situation. Captain, this is Avery White, aeronautical engineer. The anomalies we're detecting match patterns that preceded a fatal flight control failure in Germany 2 years ago. The intermittent nature means your cockpit systems won't detect the problems until multiple failures occur simultaneously. Captain Henley's response reflected the institutional constraints that governed his decision-making authority. Ms. White, I appreciate your concern, but I can only act on maintenance recommendations from certified personnel. If ground maintenance is requesting a return to hangar, I need official confirmation from Senior Technician Ashford. The responsibility for making a definitive safety decision had fallen squarely on Ashford, whose certification and experience qualified him to ground aircraft based on maintenance concerns. But his decision would need to balance Avery's analysis against normal diagnostic readings, customer expectations, and potential liability issues. Dr. Steinberg's voice joined the radio conversation from the aircraft's cabin. Captain, we have critical regulatory meetings that cannot be delayed. If there's a genuine safety problem, we'll return immediately. But if this is a precautionary measure based on theoretical concerns, we need to proceed with our departure. The pharmaceutical executive's intervention added another layer of pressure to an already complex decision-making process. His company's regulatory timeline was built around precise scheduling that had taken months to coordinate with Swiss authorities. Delaying the Geneva presentation could affect the approval process for medication that might help millions of diabetes patients. Ashford found himself at the center of a decision that would define both his professional reputation and potentially the lives of 12 people aboard the Gulfstream. Avery's latest data was more compelling than her earlier concerns, but it still represented pattern analysis rather than definitive evidence of specific system failures. Meridian 447, this is Senior Technician Ashford, he transmitted after a long pause. Return to Hangar 7 for additional diagnostics. We're seeing anomalies that require investigation before departure. Captain Henley acknowledged the instruction with professional calm, but the disappointment in Dr. Steinberg's voice was obvious as the aircraft began its taxi back toward the hangar. The regulatory presentation that had taken months to arrange was now in jeopardy because of electrical anomalies that might or might not represent genuine safety threats. As the Gulfstream approached the hangar, Avery felt both relief and apprehension about what the additional diagnostics might reveal. Her analysis had been convincing enough to ground the aircraft, but she would now need to prove that her concerns were justified, rather than the theoretical worries of an overly cautious engineer. The escalating pattern of system anomalies suggested that more dramatic failures were imminent, but timing was critical. If the problems didn't manifest during ground testing, the pressure to authorize departure would become overwhelming and her credibility would be permanently damaged. At 2:17 p.m., as the Gulfstream taxied back toward Hangar 7, Avery's worst fears materialized in spectacular fashion. Her diagnostic tablet registered a catastrophic cascade of system failures that began with a complete loss of primary flight control signal integrity and rapidly spread throughout the aircraft's electronic networks. The fiber optic cables that carried critical control commands had finally succumbed to moisture infiltration, causing simultaneous failures across multiple redundant systems. "Jesus Christ," Morrison exclaimed, staring at his diagnostic equipment as warning indicators lit up across every display. "We're showing total loss of fly-by-wire control authority, navigation system failure, and backup flight control degradation." The aircraft's sophisticated computer systems, which had been compensating for intermittent signal interruptions for weeks, suddenly found themselves unable to process reliable control inputs from any of their sensor networks. The redundant systems that were designed to provide safety margins had been slowly degraded by the same moisture infiltration that had finally claimed the primary control channels. Captain Henley's voice crackled over the radio with controlled urgency. "Ground maintenance, we're experiencing multiple flight control system warnings. Flight management computer is showing error codes across all primary channels. Requesting immediate assistance." From the aircraft's cabin, passenger voices could be heard expressing concern as various warning lights illuminated throughout the cockpit. Dr. Steinberg appeared in the cabin doorway, his expression reflecting growing alarm about the aircraft's condition and the safety of his critical mission. Morrison was frantically connecting additional diagnostic equipment to determine the scope of the system failures. "Primary flight controls are completely offline," he reported to Ashford. "Backup systems are showing degraded performance, and the flight management computer can't establish reliable communication with any control surface actuators." Avery's predictive analysis had proven accurate in the most dramatic way possible. The failure progression she had identified had accelerated beyond her worst-case projections, with the system collapse occurring while the aircraft was still safely on the ground rather than during flight operations over the English Channel. "The moisture infiltration has compromised the entire fiber optic network," she explained to the gathering crowd of maintenance personnel. "The aircraft's computers can't distinguish between valid control signals and electronic noise. Even if they could get airborne, the pilots would have no reliable way to control the aircraft's flight path." Senior Technician Ashford stared at the diagnostic displays with growing comprehension of how close they had come to a catastrophic accident. If the system failures had manifested 20 minutes later, the Gulfstream would have been climbing through 20,000 feet with 12 people aboard when the flight controls became inoperative. "How long would it have taken to lose complete control authority?" he asked Avery, his voice reflecting new respect for her analytical capabilities. "Based on the failure progression I documented, probably 15 to 20 minutes after takeoff," she replied soberly. "The aircraft would have appeared to operate normally during taxi and initial climb, but the pilots would have gradually lost control authority as more fiber optic channels failed." Captain Henley emerged from the cockpit, his face pale but composed as he described the cascading warnings that had appeared across his flight displays. Every flight control system showed degraded or failed status within a span of 30 seconds. "I've never seen anything like it in 25 years of flying." First Officer Chen joined the discussion, adding technical details about the aircraft's behavior during the system failures. "The flight management computer couldn't establish communication with any control surfaces. Manual reversion modes weren't available because the backup systems depend on the same compromised signal pathways." Dr. Steinberg and his team disembarked from the aircraft with obvious relief at being safely on the ground, but also with deep concern about the implications for their Geneva mission. The pharmaceutical executive approached Ashford with questions about alternative transportation and revised scheduling. "How long will repairs take?" Dr. Steinberg asked. "We have regulatory presentations that represent years of research and development. The approval timeline for our diabetes medication depends on these meetings." Ashford's response reflected the sobering reality of major avionics repairs. "Sir, we're looking at extensive fiber optic cable replacement throughout the aircraft's control systems. This kind of repair requires specialized components and several days of recertification testing." The magnitude of what Avery had prevented was becoming clear to everyone involved. The system failures that had manifested during ground operations would have been catastrophic during flight, with no possibility of safe recovery once the pilots lost control authority. Her pattern analysis had identified a hidden danger that standard diagnostic procedures were incapable of detecting. Morrison approached Avery with obvious admiration for her analytical skills. "How did you know this was going to happen?" "Our diagnostic equipment never detected any of the problems you identified." "Predictive failure analysis focuses on patterns rather than individual anomalies," Avery explained. "The aircraft's computers were designed to dismiss brief signal interruptions as electronic noise, but the pattern of increasing frequency and magnitude indicated progressive system degradation." Margaret Thornton was already coordinating alternative transportation for Dr. Steinberg's team, understanding that Meridian's reputation depended on finding solutions rather than excuses. Her customer relations experience had taught her that operational problems could become customer loyalty opportunities when handled professionally. "We're arranging a replacement aircraft from our partner company in Germany," she told Dr. Steinberg. "The aircraft should arrive within 4 hours, allowing departure this evening with arrival in Geneva by 10 p.m. But the broader implications extended far beyond scheduling disruptions. The Aviation Authority would require detailed investigation of the failure mode, with potential implications for other aircraft using similar fly-by-wire systems. Avery's documentation of the failure progression would become crucial evidence for understanding how moisture infiltration could compromise redundant safety systems. Ashford found himself in the unusual position of publicly acknowledging that a supplier representative had prevented a major accident through expertise that exceeded his own team's analytical capabilities. "Ms. White, your analysis saved 12 lives today. I owe you an apology for dismissing your concerns." As emergency vehicles arrived to assist with the aircraft evacuation and system shutdown, Avery reflected on the afternoon's events with mixed emotions. She had proven the validity of her predictive analysis methods, but only by documenting a near catastrophe that had almost claimed innocent lives. The Gulfstream sat powerless in the hangar, its sophisticated systems rendered inoperative by a hidden defect that had escaped detection for months. The aircraft that had appeared perfectly airworthy just hours earlier was now grounded indefinitely, awaiting repairs that would require extensive recertification before it could safely carry passengers again. Dr. Steinberg approached Avery as his team prepared to wait for alternative transportation. "Ms. White, I understand that your analysis prevented what could have been a fatal accident. Our company develops medications that save lives, and I recognize the same commitment to protecting people in your work today." The afternoon had demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of institutional safety systems. Standard procedures had failed to detect a progressive failure that threatened catastrophic consequences, but individual expertise and persistence had identified the danger despite systemic barriers to effective communication. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the hangar floor, Avery knew that her role in aviation safety had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a supplier representative conducting routine inspections, but a recognized expert whose analytical capabilities had proven their worth under the most demanding circumstances possible. The investigation that followed the Gulfstream's system failure revealed the full scope of what Avery had prevented. Aviation Authority investigators arrived within hours, led by Chief Inspector David Crawford, a veteran accident investigator with over 15 years of experience analyzing complex system failures. His preliminary examination of the failed fiber optic networks confirmed Avery's worst fears about what would have happened if the aircraft had departed on schedule. "Ms. White," Inspector Crawford said as he reviewed her documented analysis, "your predictive failure methodology identified a catastrophic safety hazard that our standard certification procedures completely missed. The moisture infiltration had been progressing for at least 6 weeks, but the intermittent nature of the failures made them invisible to conventional diagnostic testing." The inspector's preliminary report painted a sobering picture of how close Flight 447 had come to disaster. The fiber optic degradation would have caused complete loss of flight control authority approximately 18 minutes after takeoff, when the aircraft would have been climbing through 25,000 feet over the English Channel. At that altitude and distance from shore, emergency landing options would have been non-existent. Dr. Steinberg and his pharmaceutical team, now waiting for alternative transportation, approached Avery with profound gratitude for her persistence in identifying the hidden danger. "Ms. White, your analysis didn't just save our lives, it preserved years of medical research that could help millions of diabetes patients worldwide. Our regulatory presentation will be delayed by 1 day, but the alternative could have been losing our entire research team." But the afternoon's events had also exposed fundamental flaws in the aviation industry's approach to safety oversight. Avery's expertise in predictive failure analysis had proven more effective than established diagnostic procedures. Yet institutional barriers had nearly prevented her from acting on that knowledge. The system that was designed to ensure safety had almost caused a catastrophic accident by prioritizing procedural compliance over technical insight. Margaret Thornton, Meridian's customer relations coordinator, pulled Avery aside for a private conversation about the company's response to the near disaster. Avery, management wants to offer you a position as our chief safety analyst. Your methodology could revolutionize how we approach predictive maintenance across our entire fleet. The job offer represented everything Avery had worked toward during her academic career, an opportunity to apply her research in a real-world environment where it could save lives and advance aviation safety. But it also highlighted the moral complexity of the afternoon's events. Her success had come at the cost of exposing institutional failures that had nearly caused a tragedy. Senior Technician Ashford approached with obvious humility about his earlier dismissal of her concerns. "Ms. White, I owe you more than an apology. My certification and experience should have made me recognize the significance of your analysis, but I let procedural thinking override technical judgment. Would you be willing to help us develop new diagnostic protocols that could prevent similar oversights?" The request reflected a broader recognition that aviation safety required evolution beyond traditional approaches. Ashford's willingness to acknowledge his limitations and seek improvement demonstrated the kind of professional growth that could emerge from near-catastrophe experiences. James Morrison, the lead avionics technician, had been documenting the failure mode for his own professional development. "Avery, your pattern recognition methodology identified problems that our computer systems were specifically programmed to ignore. How do we modify our diagnostic approaches to detect these kinds of progressive failures?" The technical discussion that followed revealed the challenge facing modern aviation maintenance. Aircraft systems had become so sophisticated that their built-in diagnostic capabilities could mask developing problems until they reached catastrophic proportions. Predictive analysis required human expertise that complemented rather than replaced automated testing procedures. Inspector Crawford's investigation was expanding beyond the immediate failure to examine broader implications for fleet safety. "Ms. White, we're recommending that your analytical methodology be incorporated into standard maintenance protocols for all fly-by-wire aircraft. The patterns you identified could indicate similar problems across multiple aircraft types and manufacturers." The regulatory implications were enormous. If moisture infiltration could compromise fiber optic systems in ways that escaped detection by standard procedures, thousands of aircraft worldwide might be operating with hidden vulnerabilities. Avery's analysis had identified not just a single aircraft problem, but a potential systemic safety issue affecting modern aviation technology. As evening approached and alternative transportation arrangements were finalized, Avery found herself at a crossroads that would define her future career. She could return to her comfortable role as a supplier representative, conducting routine inspections and filing reports that no one would read. Or she could accept the challenge of revolutionizing aviation safety through predictive analysis that might prevent future tragedies. The choice represented more than professional advancement. It carried moral responsibility for acting on knowledge that could save lives. Her success in preventing one accident had demonstrated both the potential and the burden of expertise that others didn't possess or understand. Dr. Steinberg's team boarded their replacement aircraft just after sunset, trusting once again in aviation professionals to deliver them safely to Geneva. But their confidence was now informed by understanding how close they had come to disaster and how individual expertise had made the difference between life and death. The moral weight of that responsibility would follow Avery into whatever decision she made about her future role in aviation safety. 3 weeks after the Gulfstream incident, Avery stood in the conference room of the European Aviation Safety Agency headquarters in Cologne, Germany, facing a panel of senior investigators and regulatory officials who would determine whether her predictive analysis methodology would be adopted as standard practice across European aviation. The presentation she was about to deliver could revolutionize aircraft maintenance procedures or be dismissed as an expensive solution to rare problems. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "the Heathrow incident demonstrated that our current diagnostic procedures are inadequate for detecting progressive system failures in modern fly-by-wire aircraft. We need to evolve beyond reactive maintenance toward predictive analysis that can identify problems before they become catastrophic." The panel included representatives from major airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and regulatory agencies across Europe. Their decision would affect maintenance protocols for thousands of aircraft and could prevent accidents that traditional methods couldn't detect. But implementing her recommendations would require significant investment in new diagnostic equipment and training programs. Director Klaus Weber of the German Federal Bureau of Aircraft Accident Investigation challenged her methodology with questions that reflected industry skepticism about unproven techniques. Ms. White, your analysis identified one failure mode in one aircraft. How do we justify restructuring entire maintenance programs based on a single incident? Avery had anticipated this objection and prepared comprehensive data to support broader implementation. Sir, my research has identified similar failure patterns in 12 other incidents over the past 5 years. The Heathrow case was unique only because the failure occurred on the ground rather than during flight operations. She presented case studies from accidents across Europe and North America, showing how predictive analysis could have identified the precursor patterns that led to catastrophic failures. The data was compelling but also sobering. Multiple accidents could have been prevented if her methodology had been available to maintenance teams. Captain Elizabeth Nordstrom from Scandinavian Airlines provided the pilot perspective on operational implementation. Ms. White, pilots need to understand what these predictive warnings mean for flight safety. How do we translate your analysis into actionable information for flight crews? The question highlighted the practical challenge of integrating predictive analysis into existing operational procedures. Avery's methodology required training programs that could teach maintenance personnel and pilots to recognize patterns that computers couldn't detect automatically. Captain, the key is developing alert systems that distinguish between routine anomalies and patterns that indicate progressive failures, Avery explained. Pilots would receive warnings only when multiple indicators suggest imminent system degradation, not for every minor fluctuation that falls within normal parameters. Dr. Sarah Chen from Airbus provided the manufacturer perspective on implementing predictive diagnostics in new aircraft designs. Ms. White, your methodology requires extensive data logging and analysis capabilities. How do we integrate these requirements into aircraft systems without adding weight, complexity, and cost? Avery had worked with several manufacturers to develop integrated solutions that leveraged existing aircraft computers for predictive analysis. Dr. Chen, modern aircraft already generate terabytes of operational data that we're not analyzing effectively. My methodology uses existing data streams but applies pattern recognition algorithms that current systems don't employ. The technical discussion continued for 2 hours, covering implementation costs, training requirements, and regulatory frameworks for adopting predictive maintenance procedures. Each question revealed the complexity of transforming individual expertise into systematic safety improvements that could be applied across the global aviation industry. Inspector Crawford, who had investigated the Heathrow incident, provided crucial support for regulatory adoption. The failure mode Ms. White identified has been found in 14 additional aircraft during expanded inspections. Her methodology has already prevented multiple potential accidents by identifying problems that standard procedures missed. The regulatory implications were becoming clear. Avery's predictive analysis had evolved from an academic research project into a practical safety tool that could save lives and prevent accidents. But implementation required institutional commitment to changing established procedures that had served the industry for decades. As the presentation concluded, Avery knew that her decision to pursue systematic change rather than individual consulting opportunities would define her contribution to aviation safety. She had chosen to share her methodology openly rather than protecting it as proprietary knowledge, believing that widespread implementation would save more lives than exclusive application. The panel's deliberation would determine whether her choice had been wise or naive. If they approved regulatory adoption, her work would become standard practice across European aviation. If they rejected her recommendations, she would return to her role as a supplier representative with enhanced reputation but limited ability to implement broader safety improvements. Director Weber's final question cut to the heart of her motivation. Ms. White, why did you choose to share your methodology publicly rather than developing it as a commercial product? Her answer reflected the moral conviction that had driven her throughout the Heathrow crisis. Sir, safety innovations should serve the public good rather than private profit. My goal is preventing accidents, not building a consulting business. The panel voted unanimously to recommend mandatory implementation of predictive analysis protocols across all European Union aviation operations, with Avery appointed as technical advisor for the transition program. Her decision to prioritize public safety over personal gain had created the opportunity to revolutionize aviation maintenance procedures worldwide. 6 months after the Heathrow incident, Avery White stood in the same hangar where she had once been dismissed as an overly concerned supplier representative, but now her presence commanded immediate attention from aviation professionals across Europe. As the newly appointed Director of Predictive Safety Analysis for the European Aviation Safety Agency, she had become one of the youngest and most influential safety experts in modern aviation history. The transformation was visible in every interaction. Senior technicians who had once questioned her authority now sought her input on complex diagnostic challenges. Pilots requested briefings on her predictive analysis techniques. Aircraft manufacturers consulted her during design reviews to ensure their systems could support the advanced monitoring protocols she had developed. "Avery," called Captain Henley as she entered the hangar for a routine inspection visit, "we've implemented your predictive monitoring system across our entire fleet. The early warning capabilities have already identified 3 potential failures that could have caused in-flight emergencies." The success of her methodology had exceeded even her most optimistic projections. In 6 months of implementation across European aviation, predictive analysis had identified 47 progressive failures that traditional diagnostics had missed. The prevented accidents represented hundreds of lives saved and millions of dollars in avoided damage, validating her decision to pursue systematic change rather than individual recognition. Margaret Thornton, now serving as Meridian's Vice President of Safety Operations, approached with updates on the company's expanded predictive maintenance program. "Avery, your protocols have transformed our approach to aircraft reliability. We're detecting problems weeks before they become critical, allowing us to schedule maintenance during routine inspections rather than emergency groundings." The economic benefits had proven as compelling as the safety improvements. Airlines using predictive analysis were experiencing significant reductions in unexpected maintenance events, flight delays, and customer disruptions. The methodology that had begun as academic research was now driving measurable improvements in operational efficiency across the industry. Dr. Steinberg, whose pharmaceutical company had benefited from that fateful prevented accident, had become an advocate for predictive safety analysis in other industries. "Avery, your work saved our research team and enabled us to secure EU approval for our diabetes medication. We're now funding similar predictive analysis research for medical device safety." The cross-industry applications of her methodology were expanding into healthcare, automotive safety, and infrastructure monitoring. Pattern recognition techniques that had identified aircraft system failures were being adapted to predict medical device malfunctions, automotive component degradation, and structural engineering problems. James Morrison, who had supported her during the critical Heathrow investigation, was now leading technical implementation of predictive diagnostics across multiple aircraft manufacturers. "Avery, your influence has extended far beyond that single incident. We're seeing fundamental changes in how the entire industry approaches safety analysis." The training programs she had developed were being implemented in aviation schools worldwide, teaching the next generation of maintenance professionals to recognize patterns that computers couldn't detect automatically. Her academic research had evolved into practical education that would influence aviation safety for decades. Inspector Crawford approached with data from the first comprehensive analysis of predictive maintenance effectiveness. "Avery, the preliminary results are extraordinary. European airlines using your protocols have experienced a 73% reduction in unexpected system failures and a 45% decrease in maintenance-related flight delays." The statistical validation of her methodology had earned recognition from aviation authorities worldwide. The International Civil Aviation Organization had adopted her protocols as recommended practice for all member nations, extending the safety benefits beyond Europe to global aviation operations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the crews and passengers whose lives had been protected by her work. Letters arrived weekly from pilots, maintenance technicians, and travelers who had been kept safe by early detection of problems that might otherwise have caused catastrophic failures. As the afternoon sun streamed through the hangar's skylights, illuminating the same workspace where she had once struggled to be heard, Avery reflected on the journey that had transformed her from an overlooked supplier representative into a globally recognized safety expert. The change hadn't come from seeking authority or recognition, but from persistent dedication to protecting lives through technical excellence. The young Czech engineer who had started the year conducting routine hydraulic inspections was now shaping the future of aviation safety worldwide. Her story demonstrated that expertise combined with moral courage could overcome institutional barriers and create lasting change that benefited millions of people. The hangar that had once seemed to constrain her potential had become the launching point for innovations that would protect aviators and passengers for generations to come. The visitor badge she had worn that fateful morning had been replaced by the authority to implement changes that would prevent countless tragedies. Her transformation was complete, but her work was just beginning. As aviation technology continued to evolve, the need for predictive analysis would only grow, ensuring that Avery White's influence on aviation safety would extend far into the future. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.